Okay, everyone. So I think we're ready to go ahead and start the next session. So we're very fortunate to have a panel discussion here with a number of amazing presenters on opportunities and barriers in bridging research and practice. And so Sera Linardi, professor in economics at Pittsburgh and an executive committee member of EAAMO, is going to moderate. So I'll let her kick things off.
Thank you, Brian. Okay. Hi, so I'm Sera Linardi. I'm associate professor at GISPIA at University of Pittsburgh and director of CASI at University of Pittsburgh. So I would like to introduce our panel today. So Rebecca Johnson is assistant professor at the Public Policy School at Georgetown University. She studies how social policy makes data and discretion to decide who needs help most urgently. And we have Sello Mokwena from the University of Limpopo, is that right? Limpopo, yeah, okay. In South Africa, where he is the professor of computer science, studying adoption of technology in developing countries. And Emanuela Galasso from the World Bank is a senior economist at the Development Research Group, studying nutrition, early childhood development, and social protection. So with that, we're going to have 10-minute presentation from each panelist. And then after we have the three presentation, then we'll have some moderated discussion. We can take questions from the audience and Q&As. All right.
Okay, so thanks so much for having me here. I'm a demographer and sociologist working at a policy school, and I'm going to be talking about translating computational projects into practice. My personal work and what I'm going to be talking about is pretty parochial. It's just US government agencies. So I'm really happy that Sello and Emanuela will be able to provide a more international perspective. So I'm going to start with an example of the type of project that we saw presented a lot today that didn't translate into practice before discussing some projects that have translated into practice and sort of some observations on why and why not. So why are certain computational projects adopted and translated by government agencies? Others sort of end at the GitHub repo and academic paper stage. So our example was through the Data Science for Social Good Fellowship, which I know some of you have participated in or have students who have participated in. So this was under Mayor de Blasio's administration. We were helping an office within his administration shift from what we call reactive rights enforcement to more proactive enforcement of tenant rights. So previously, the administration had, been leaving flyers under tenant stores, informing them of their rights as tenants, especially tenants living in rent-stabilized units, their rights to, adequate housing, timely address of repair by their landlords, and other measures. So an unit within the administration, the tenant support unit, they hire community organizers from the impacted communities who are subject to illegal practices by landlords and also increasing housing prices. So these community organizers go canvassing, they hear about housing conditions and issues that the tenants face and potential rights violations by the tenants' landlords. So we use de-identified data from the canvassing software. We use supervised machine learning to predict different labels. So, any issues with the landlord, particular quantities of issues within buildings. And we generalize from the label data to build risk scores for all buildings in the canvassers' outreach areas. So this is an example of, some of the predictions. This is part of North Manhattan. We basically, all the predictions were at the building level, and we scored buildings by their likelihood of experiencing issues with the landlord to prioritize sort of higher risk buildings for earlier outreach, lower risk buildings for later outreach. So, we published the typical conference proceeding paper, but it didn't get adopted within the government agency. And I think actually the talks in the last panel illustrated a lot of the mechanisms behind that lack of adoption. So I think one mechanism is thinking about the technical capacity within the government agency itself. So is this sort of a one-off project or collaboration, or is this something that develops more organically by people who have been at the agency for many years and who sort of build the technical system themselves? I think other challenges are the conflict between the computational model and sort of politics and political priorities. So in general, the canvassing efforts were very underfunded. Housing is a very contentious issue within New York City, and so there were also political barriers to adoption. So in contrast to that example of unsuccessful translation of a computational project into practice, I've been involved in efforts that have resulted in a lot more successful translations. So these are with different government partners, but with the Department of Housing and Urban Development and Department of Education, me and collaborators worked on a field experiment, an applied effort to place increased college counseling resources in public housing developments, and linking it with educational data to see whether it increased rates of FAFSA completion and college going among teenage residents. We've also collaborated with the DC's Office of the Deputy Mayor for Education to take data from de-identified data from online learning platforms to correct some of the media narratives about students in poverty disappearing from contact with schools, showing that school efforts can really help maintain contact. We collaborated with the Small Business Administration and local economic development corporations to look at the disbursement of relief for small businesses during COVID-19, look at the impact of different allocation methods on demographic inequality and access to help, also with the census and HUD on machine learning to predict non-response in federal statistical surveys. So to reflect on, some unsuccessful partnerships and more successful partnerships, and to try to, generalize from my admittedly anecdotal experience, I think a couple challenges have been highlighted in different talks today, but those challenges also lead to opportunities. So I think a big challenge that a lot of these projects have touched in is that despite, books like Automating Inequality or Algorithms of Oppression, stuff like that, and a lot of concern about social service bureaucracies using machine learning and computation, most social service bureaucracies still rely on really simple allocation methods. So what my co-author Simone Zhang and I call in a fact paper categorical prioritization. And this involves, manually developing really, really simple decision rules for allocating help. So as an example of this, we looked at, school finance formulas in K through 12 education. And those finance formulas, don't use really any data or don't really develop any sophisticated predictive tools like, let's allocate more money to schools where there's a higher risk of the students not progressing to college or dropping out of high school, or where the students face greater barriers related to poverty. Instead, they use categories that are argued about and result from a very political process, and that can result in inequality. So in terms of opportunities, I think the most obvious one is that even pretty basic and straightforward computational projects can represent a large improvement in terms of equity over whatever the status quo method is in the bureaucracy. I think a challenge that we've encountered and that some of the projects have encountered today are the challenge is sort of the politics of why the fair solution hasn't been implemented. So the paper I really liked with school attendance boundaries within districts that create segregation, why haven't fair boundaries been implemented in many school districts? And I think the opportunities are partnerships with qualitative scholars and practitioners to help understand the bureaucratic and political hurdles to adoption. So as an example, in our work on the allocation of small business relief, we saw a lot of first come, first served methods implemented, which we know from research can perpetuate demographic inequality, and a reluctance to use point systems or lottery-based methods. And in talking to local officials within the social service bureaucracies, it was interesting because especially the ones from pretty small towns, they know all of the applicants to the relief program. So for them, first come, first served was preferable to something like a lottery because it was easy to explain to, their cousin down the street, like, hey, like you're in a line, it's first come, first serve, versus a lottery. They didn't feel comfortable explaining that and played that role. I think I'm gonna skip the participatory dimension because I think the last papers are really great on that. I think the last challenge is just difficulty funding and retaining technical capacity within government agencies themselves. So creating room not just for one-off academic collaborations, but long-term data scientists and people in technical roles who can build and maintain these things in a sustained way. So thanks so much, and excited for the discussion. Thanks.
Where's my...
Let me pull it up here. I think it's, so it's in Chrome.
Okay. And then how do I...
Slideshow.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored, and it's a privilege for me to be here. And I want to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share with you some of the barriers and opportunities that we have to translate research into practice in African countries. And I should hasten to say that obviously, Africa is not a homogeneous continent where everything is the same everywhere. And that's why I'm going to use South Africa as a case study or an example of the things that I'm going to talk about. I mean, it's very ironic that many talks that have been presented here, especially about discrimination and how people are being closed out into certain measures, that actually people who need to go into those measures in greater numbers are the ones who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. But normally, I mean, there will be an additional barrier for people to actually get into those measures, which can actually be helpful to them. So it's the same problem that we have. I mean, Africa has a lot of problems, but we do not have enough resources to actually conduct the research, which will actually be helpful at the end of the day to people in these countries. And I mean, you should be aware that the national research systems in Africa are generally very weak. And that is shown by the fact that our contribution to global research is actually very low. So most of the time we are consumers more than we are actually producers of knowledge. And as a result, there's an urgent need to prioritize and promote and support research in developing countries. And I'm going to talk about South Africa in particular. And something that I'm very passionate about, I mean, as an academic and working with students doing research, both masters and doctorate, is that we should be able to produce people who can be critical thinkers, who can actually make a contribution, who can be confident everywhere, and who can actually develop themselves and take whatever opportunities which are available everywhere actually for their self-development. And part of the reason why I actually came to this particular conference, I was saying to the colleagues in the faculty session, that for me to come here is more about networking and to see how one can use the opportunities available here actually to help develop others who are actually coming after us. So I just want to talk about the key challenges here. The first one is lack of resources to carry out research in Africa, and we have the same problem in South Africa. And when I'm talking about resources, I'm talking about both fiscal resources and actually to a great extent human resources. And actually, as you are aware that, I mean, I'm drawing this a parallel between what happened during the times of slavery, that the strongest people from developing countries were taken to Europe and to the USA to go and work there. And basically you leave the weak ones behind. And now what is happening in the computer era, digital era, is you take the best minds away from Africa and you leave those who are not able to actually contribute as much as possible. So part of the lack of these human resources is because of the brain drain, that people go where there are best opportunities, partly because of the fact that our countries are not all that organized and sometimes are not even safe. And another thing also is lack of interest or motivation to do research. In South Africa, we have two types of universities. We've got universities which were privileged white universities, and we have what we call previously disadvantaged universities, which were basically black universities. And actually, tomorrow when I give my talk, I'll talk a little bit about these kind of things. When I went to university, I could only go to a black university because as black people, you're not allowed to go to those privileged white universities. So then what happened over time was that black universities actually just became teaching universities. And there's just this general lack of interest or motivation to do research because there were no incentives for those who are actually interested in doing research. And there's also a low uptake of research by African government and policymakers. One of the problems that we experience, for example, when our students have to go and collect data in a government department, you find somebody who actually has not done research and is holding a high position there, and that person just becomes a doorkeeper. They are not cooperating because they don't understand the value of research and how you can actually use research to improve what people are doing, and which is basically what we are trying to do. And the biggest problem that we have is lack or poor research supervision. So we don't have enough supervisors within our universities. I mean, both previously advantaged and even it's worse in previously disadvantaged universities. The university I'm working for now, I have just joined in 2019, just before the pandemic. Part of the reason why I went to that particular university is the university didn't have a PhD program because there were not enough researchers or supervisors in that particular institution to be able to offer a doctorate. And one of the biggest problems that we are experiencing now is shortage of external research assessors or examiners. I mean, we have a pipeline of students now who are doing research. I mean, in the university where I'm working now, we are doing research in machine learning. And within the country, you really struggle to get people who can examine those students. And that's why I see coming here as a good opportunity, a wonderful opportunity that one can actually get more people that can actually come along and be able to help with this assessment of our students. Right, and then I just want to look at some few initiatives in terms of research and research development. The first one is in health. World Health Organization has developed a strategy for 2016 to 2025, where actually African countries are involved, and South Africa is also involved there. And there have been other processes in 1993 to 2003, and also there was a research strategy which was adopted in 2010. I mean, a global research strategy which involves African countries and to promote research there. And in terms of education, something which is a problem in South Africa, it's there are very few people who start from undergraduate up to doctorate. The average age of obtaining a PhD in South Africa is around 45 years. And the reason for that is what most of us would do, because you come from a poor background, you must do your undergraduate, and when you finish, you must actually go and work. So, I mean, for example, I did my master's and my doctorate whilst I was working. I mean, you are working and you get married, you've got so many other things. And that is the general experience of a lot of people. So there's this particular initiative called African Doctoral Academy, which is supported by Stellenbosch University. I happen to be actually one of the first people who actually attended this particular one, because the idea is to develop people who can actually do doctoral research, doctoral supervision in African universities. And then also there is the Deep Learning Indaba, which is another initiative. For example, in 2022, there were almost 350 people who attended a week-long conference where there was teaching events, research, and also exchange and debates about the state of machine learning in Africa, South Africa, and all these other countries. Again, I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I'll try to be. This is an interesting I'm really happy to be here because I work on developing countries where the level of disadvantage is really extreme, and I work on a lot of multidisciplinary projects. So I'm very happy to be here to think about how to bridge a dialogue between researchers across different disciplines. I'm an economist by training, but I've been working a lot of public health, nutrition, and early childhood development in very low-income settings where you have to engage with government counterparts, but also nutritionists, social protection specialists, practitioners, early childhood development researchers, and local researchers, for that matter, who have to be included in the process of producing research that is relevant to the setting that you're working in. And so I want to just give you like a tale of an embedded research that I've been involved in for quite a few years in Madagascar. And when you talk about disadvantage, we are talking about extreme poverty. So if you know that the extreme poverty rate in the global in the world is about, well, now with COVID, it might be ticking up again, but it's about 10% of the world population lives in extreme poverty, which was defined as $190 a day, and now it's $215. And sub-Saharan Africa, if you see on the panel on the left, is about 40%, sort of the 40% prevalence of extreme poverty. And I've been working in Madagascar, where more than 80% or more than 70% of the population live in extreme poverty. So the sheer scale of the challenge, where you think about disadvantaged countries or disadvantaged communities, is really daunting. And I've been working on human capital development, and especially focus on the early years. And this is a human capital index that sort of benchmarks how much of a child who was born today could reach its potential development in terms of health, child survival, nutrition, schooling, and then sort of a healthy life. And a child who was born in Madagascar can reach only up to 40% of his total potential. And so what I've been working on is sort of working with the government in thinking about, you start from a foundational human capital, which is health and nutrition, and it's basically survival. And we're not talking about thriving, and started evaluating a community-based health and nutrition program that have been put in a scale from the late 90s. And we work with the government, trying to support some iterative learning with RCTs, and focusing both on improving the quality of the existing program, but thinking about how to also use the evidence base from the literature and expanding the scope of what early childhood development, what do the children need? It's not only education and health, but also early stimulation. And so when maybe most of your programs are working with very sort of small communities, but when you start engaging with the government and you think about scale brings about service delivery where multiple agencies are involved, multiple ministries, because it's a multidimensional set of constraints. You have to work with the nutrition office, with the health with the health ministry, with the education ministry, and lots of sort of non-state actors or private sectors. And all these services are very human resource intensive. So thinking about only a technological sort of solution might not be the solution to reach the most to get the highest quality of service delivery. And so the main questions that I've been working on is who delivers what type of programs, what packages of program, and to whom, and especially how, because so that's what I think maybe some of the discussion would be useful. And in thinking about why and engaging with the government, even very simple policy messages have to be really sort of come across. For example, in the panel to the left, we basically show that the height for age, so the definition of severe sort of chronic malnutrition is whether this height for age Z-score is below -2 standard deviation in a normal population. And in Madagascar, this happens when kids are, by the time they reach, they age 12 months, they're already, half of the population is stunted. And so just providing this simple message about the critical age in which you have to prevent, you have to act during the first 1,000 days to prevent malnutrition is already, I mean, going about simple messages has already an important policy implication about where, when, and whom to reach and when. But then if sort of providing data, collecting longitudinal surveys and tracking cohorts that are and sort of documented also the socioeconomic gradients, even in such a poor setting about child development, we can show that even in an extremely poor setting, you have inequalities and inequities. And so by the time the kids are reach the age of 6 or 7, when they have to enter school, there are huge socioeconomic gradients in sustained attention, in language, and in learning that translate into learning gaps. So just providing an analytical base of what the situation is as sort of opens the window to engage with the government. And then when we provide and clarify what in such a setting, what is feasible, you start with the community-based nutrition program, and then we engage with the RCT, working with the government program, and try to think, well, can we expand the intensive counseling, and is it the quality of the service that's provided that is the barrier, or can we include a nutrition supplementation or maybe a cash transfer, which was not feasible at the moment, to think about expanding the needs of the children, or how can we integrate within the same program cognitive stimulation? And so we bring the external evidence from the literature and try to implement it at scale and integrating programs with RCTs, trying to look improving not only the quality but the scope of the interventions. And so just sort of a few when there's a lot of emphasis on design of the intervention, but when you actually thinking about how to implement it at scale, the how becomes really sort of the reality hits the check. So you really have to clearly think about who's delivering the program, how to recruit them, select them, motivate them, how to train them and coach them. There's very low capacity. So some of the things have been already touched upon. And it's not a one time off. So you really have to engage with iterative learning. So you prototype things that are feasible in the context. You have to diagnose what the feasibility possibilities are, and then you try to iterate and do mechanism and experiment, not only to think about the ideal sort of scenario, but then think about rapid A/B testing to implement things and innovations that could work on the ground. And then you need an MIS system that tracks coverage and quality. So I just wanted to give you this example, because this comes from a Shiny R app that we provided and sort of to monitor implementations and working with the supervisor in checking attendance. But in local setting environment, you work with paper registries, which are at this level, and this because there's no electricity coverage or access to data. in the entire country. It's sort of huge infrastructure challenges. The paper registry get copied and uploaded on a tablet, which then gets uploaded. And the number of, say, errors that in this translation are huge. So just by, you have really to keep on checking not only the design of the intervention, but the implementation becomes a huge scope for tracking quality and tracking the implementation of the program. So I just wanted to sort of provide like a window into the interplay between diagnostics, bringing the evidence base and design of the interventions, but really focusing on at scale of what are the constraints that governments are facing in thinking about shifting entire distributions of human capital. So thinking about the what, the how, and looking at all the details. Thank you.
This is a hand for all of our panelists. Can we give a hand to all of them? Thank you so much. There's so many questions in my head. I really like the summary here. But I think the first question is, I noticed that in the implementation level, at some point, we get to a place that is very human resource intensive, right? And in Rebecca's example, there is like, going and realizing the bureaucracy is such that you really need qualitative researcher to figure out what's going on. In Sello's case, it is that the people who knows how to best fix things don't have the research capacity, right? And then in your case, you have people who are doing things on paper, and that is the thing to overcome. And then at the same time, when we bring in someone from the outside, there's already an inherent power differential. And when we add on top of that the extra technical skills that they have, it could create just a very separate, like a big separation between the people that we're intending to bring together. So what is your experience in either overcoming that or even just experiencing it? So, anybody?
Well, I've been working on this for a while, for a long time, and I think sort of first thing, embed the research. So do not come with providing solutions ex ante that you think might be working, but really work on the diagnostics about what the barriers are. So a lot of formative research is now, in terms of designing, is focusing on human-centered design. So you have, there's a lot of work that it's trying to really think about what are the barriers on the supply side, what are the barriers on the demand side, and how is the program experienced, not as planned, but what are the constraints that people are facing in implementing or in receiving or accessing the program. And there you have to work with qualitative, we have to work with people who are local researchers and experienced, experienced local researchers and qualitative work to really think about what you're trying to do instead of bringing solutions from the outside that might not work in the context. And on the technical side, I think there's a lot. I mean, even in such a low constrained environment, there's a lot of capacity of sort of young people who could be put to good use. So I think sort of the point that my colleague is making on bringing up the huge potential of students that are there who don't have opportunities for internships, or so. For example, we brought students of the School of Public Works locally to work on training for child development, or there are people with sort of statistical or capacity who can just be trained and work. I mean, I think in terms of partnerships with local and external researchers and bring them along, breaks down this power dynamics.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Actually, my last slide there was saying, how can you help? I mean, as members of this audience, to help us deal with some of these problems. But I think it's important when one tries to help that you do not impose yourself on the person that you are helping, that you go in there, you do your own research, and you listen. Because we have a big problem. I was doing research, for example, on the use of school management information systems. And what I found in a lot of schools were companies who have donated computers for those schools. And all they did was just what we call digital dumping. So they bring the machines, they build a laboratory, and they leave it at that. And then the people don't know how to use those machines. So there's no plan except that, I mean, these things have been provided. So I think it's important when somebody wants to help is to understand the conditions so that your help will actually become helpful and not a waste. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo some of those points, I think just this idea of avoiding wasted help or not letting help go to waste. I think it's important to acknowledge that the incentives within academia are often geared towards wasted help in certain ways, like ending at a publication or ending at whatever is the, discrete promotable thing. So I do think that efforts to, build more technical capacity within government agencies themselves and nonprofits, and especially address some of, the reasons why people don't go into government service, why people with technical skills don't go into government service, whether it's, sort of Silicon Valley messaging about government as the problem, whether it's, opaque application systems within government hiring. I think there's a lot of people working to improve those things and, hire people whose incentive is sustained change and not, ending at an academic publication.
Thank you. Is there a question by the audience? Okay. Oh, there's a question from the audience here. Good.
Hi, I'm really enjoying the perspectives that have been put forth. I come from Nepal. There was a little bit of talk about brain drain. For a country as small as ours, with a population of 3 million people, every year about 35,000 students go abroad to study. So I was interested in knowing your perspective on how you could possibly tackle that problem, given the fact that there aren't resources or training opportunities for these students to stay back home. Also, adding to that, I have a second question about research sort of knowledge being stopped at the end of publication. I just wanted to know your perspectives on paywalls because, all of these students from back home, I know a couple of people from back home who have like interesting ideas. They want to have access to all of this knowledge that is being created in places where there are opportunities, but they're behind paywalls. And our government in particular does not allow international transactions in dollars, which is weird in the first place. But I also want to know your perspective on paywalls and how we as researchers might begin to overcome these sort of functional hurdles that prevent people from accessing that knowledge.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we now have the internet, which makes it possible for people to learn where they are. And I think if we can harness that aspect of e-learning and create those opportunities. I mean, for example, the reason why I'm excited to be here, I was saying to somebody, sometimes I look for somebody's bio and I like what the person is doing and I drop them an email, but that email never gets replied. But I mean, if we've met face to face, I send you an email. Obviously, you'll know who I am and what I'm about and that kind of a thing. I think we can actually harness that and make sure that we use electronic means for people to actually learn. There are a number of institutions, for example, we're working with now, And our students don't have to go there because we can actually use the internet to do whatever we actually want to do. And I think that's something that we need to look at and see how best we can actually use it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Just quickly, I think sort of it's hard to block the brain drain. I mean, the level of individual opportunities and obviously ideas to grow and have the potential to experience. It's just hard to reverse. It cannot be blocked. But I think sort of there's a lot of exciting examples of building institutions that allow grad students to stay back and or work with on their own countries. I mean, there's excellent research institutions in Pakistan, for example, or in India that really are bringing a lot of students back, and maybe they can study abroad, but they can start work towards finding a solution for their own country. And the same sort of in Africa, there are 2-3 hubs of really excellent research institutions that really attract African scholars, and that has to be fostered. On paywall, yeah, I think we have. Yeah, I mean, the positive aspect of sort of big data is that there is a democratization of also access data for analysis. So the type of the range of data that people can access from everywhere and that it's public access has really skyrocketed exponentially. So there's a positive aspect to sort of globalization, but the paywall is a major, I mean, it's a collective action problem, and that should be fought with sort of really hard.
Thank you,
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, something which will be helpful, it's when we have exchange of students. That I mean that you can send your students to, for example, to South Africa for a period of time, and you can have those students come here for a period of time. And in that way, they don't have to go away forever because, I mean, the transfer of knowledge and technology would actually happen in that process. Okay.
Right. Yes, transfer technology takes a long time. And I want to go back to Rebecca's point about incentives, right? So I think where, if I let me know if I'm wrong, but what I heard was like, we in academia, we do have this incentive system where like the transfer stops when the publication is guaranteed, right? And I hear from other people the sense of getting someone else who has the correct incentive to do either bring up the capacity of the local partner or spend that time to like co-develop the solutions, right? Because a lot of researcher wants well-defined research problems, which you don't necessarily get like when you first enter into a partnership. So I'm wondering if like when we think about connecting research and practice in terms of researcher and like, nonprofit, maybe that is a gap too far, and in between them, there are actually other actors that we should be lining up, right? Like you were saying, people who could increase their research capacity, or people who could frame the problem, the way you guys were saying it. In your areas, who are this kind of stepping stones between the researcher and the practitioner that you can identify? And have you worked with them?
I could discuss briefly, but again, very parochial US context. Something that has been useful for me has been these matchmaker organizations, where they basically fund academics to go on public service leaves from their home institutions for a year or sometimes a couple years. And that's useful, right? Because you're not trying to teach and do, everything that you're trying to do as a tenure track academic while engaged in these. I think it's also useful because a lot of government agencies are rightfully suspicious of academics coming in and sort of taking the data and disappearing for, a number of years and then saying, hey, we published this, like, isn't it useful? So these matchmaking organizations are sort of in a position to build long-term relationships with agencies that foster trust and foster sort of collaborations. So the one I've been involved in is the Office of Evaluation Sciences, which is within the General Services Administration. And I think and that's one at the federal level, and I think there's others that are emerging at the local level. Yeah, but I'd be curious on other organizations.
Yeah, thank you. In our case, we have worked with companies like Microsoft, Huawei, AWS, which actually helps to bridge that gap because, I mean, they've got resources which they can offer, they've got technical help. So it's helpful, I mean, for the student to bridge that gap, I mean, between just theory and practice, and also to be able to go into a work environment. So that's something that we are doing also. Yeah.
This is a big question. I think sort of, I mean, in the past 10 or 20 years, definitely in the space of development, institutions like Innovation for Poverty Action and IPA and JPAL have been really instrumental in bridging this gap. Mostly they started with blue sky research of trying to understand testing sort of models, but also trying to understand what works and what doesn't and why. And so there's a lot of matchmaking that goes through finding NGOs that have good innovative solutions that can sort of that do this prep work in terms of thinking about solutions that might be working on the ground. And this matchmaking process of matching researchers with local organization has really been instrumental to that in that regard. But then it's increasingly moving towards engaging with governments, local governments and state governments, in really trying to fill in the gap. International organizations like, the World Bank, and also bilateral, like or regional multilaterals that work in East Asia or in Latin America have also played this role in facilitating contact with the government. But the incentives of, unless you partner with local academics, it's hard to motivate academics just to work on a project, especially if the program does not go or as intended. Then researchers are always the residual claimants on sort of failures. And so you have to have a good match or incentive to keep on iterating and trying to make it work.
So there's a bunch of questions. So there's one there. But I just want to throw something out there. So before everybody in the audience go out and find a matchmaking organization, right? Is there anything are they absolved of other sort of research to practice thinking or best practices when they have a matchmaking organization, because that organization will take care of everything? Or should they still be conscious of potentially exploitative things that still could happen? Does anybody have a quick answer to that one before we take audience questions? I'm just really curious.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there are people who actually have self-interest when they're trying to help somebody. I mean, we have seen those kind of things. And that's why I was saying it's important, if somebody wants to help, that they understand the context in which they're actually helping, and they should actually be able to develop those people. For example, we have a problem now in South Africa where we have foreign academics. They come and they do research, even for their own countries. They use our students, but then they don't develop our students. I mean, somebody can have a master's, can have a doctorate, but it's not an independent thinker. After they've worked with that person, they cannot do research. But that person has published a lot. I mean, even gets promotion and so on, but has not helped the people who actually help them in return. And I mean, it's something that, for example, our government now has come up with policies. Like, if you are a foreign academic, you must develop so many people and they must be able to do the following things. And because of that exploitation which was happening. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, audience.
Thank you. It's been great to hear these conversations. I actually have the unique privilege to be an embedded qualitative researcher within a data science unit at the federal government in India. So I can relate to a lot of the conversations that we've been having through this panel discussion. And my question for all of you is about closing the loop. You're talking about going from research to practice, but about the other way around. For practitioners to be able to talk back to the academy and to have positions and experiences also integrated not into just what researchers are doing, but also have other practitioners hear and learn from our voices. And how do you adjust the methodological constraints that exist for embedded researchers, especially from the global South and from non-Western contexts? Whether it's constraints such as researching the same organization that you work for, or having challenges with getting our work reviewed and published, and how do you sort of try to overcome those things to be able to close this research loop?
Yeah, definitely no great answers, but I can talk briefly. Yeah, I think that's a really great point, that it's not only research to practice, it's listening to people who are deeply embedded in practice and learning about the questions they have and the problems they're facing in their organizations. So I guess to give an example of that, I think like with academics approaching government agencies, oftentimes they're like, oh, I want to use your data to write this paper. And they can encounter a lot of resistance because the questions they're posing are not at all what are relevant to practitioners within the agency. So that's why, again, I think, having people in long-term roles within, the organizations who aren't coming in with like predefined questions and are just seeing what questions arise organically, I think is really important. And yeah.
Yes, in our universities, like I said, we work with companies like Microsoft, AWS, even SEP. So you have these people who are in industry, and they come and take some of our students, or sometimes they themselves come to our institutions and they can actually give the practical aspects of what they're actually doing, and our students are actually able to learn from that. So it's exactly what you're saying, the reverse of we're taking practice into research and closing that gap between research and what is actually happening in practice.
I think just briefly, yeah. I think sort of there's a lot of scope for enhancing this sort of exchange between practitioners and researchers. And there's a lot of, workshops, but I think the most enlightening sort of change in terms of mindsets from governments or practitioners that I've seen are South-to-South collaborations. So there's a lot of funding for having, say, government agency or really technical people that are in charge of implementing programs travel to other settings that are facing the same constraints and having solutions that are on the ground, and then interface sort of and the researchers mediate sort of this exchange and thinking about, well, maybe this thing that happens elsewhere, maybe it can be adapted, or that would never work and cannot be adapted to our setting, but maybe we could make it our own. And so I think these South-to-South collaborations are really the most inspiring and mindset changing experiences for practitioners to see the potential for other solutions on the ground. But in federal states, or I'm assuming in India, that happens also across states or across I mean, I've seen it in Brazil, the competition, also innovations that happen in the early childhood development space is really between states who are creating innovations and then are shared with other practitioners within the same country. So it doesn't have to be only international, like Bangladesh to Madagascar, but it could also be within sort of facilitating community of practices and experiences within the same state.
In Indonesia, that is really popular among bureaucrats. They call it the study tour, and they get to they write a list of places they're going to visit on their way to comparative studies.
Yeah, they also get salary, sort of
Yes. Yes, there were. I think there was more audience question.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much to all of you for being here. I think this conversation feels very important. I think my question might sound a little bit weird coming from the crowd, but I guess as a student that has never left school, just went straight from college to PhD, I guess I'm wondering, because it feels like there's this implicit assumption that I think we all have as researchers that there's something very valuable about going through a research program, and that there's something valuable about the skills that we're accumulating, or maybe the ways in which we're being trained to think. I think Sello mentioned training independent thinkers being an important thing to have, I don't know, for doing government work. But I guess I'm just wondering what you three see as the value that researchers can add to doing policy work. I think over time it's felt less obvious to me as is it, I don't know, the specific skill sets that we're acquiring, because sometimes it feels I don't know, maybe in there's a lot of incentives in academia to do specific kinds of work that aren't necessarily the most useful for government work, when maybe there's not this high technical capacity. Or is it the resources and independence that we have that makes it ability to do work without maybe other political incentives? Or I don't know, I guess I'm just curious what you three think about that, because it feels, I guess, not obvious at this point in my career that that researchers actually are the right people, or have a lot of, I don't know, something really valuable to add to this sort of work.
Can I pile on a little bit? So with us working with community engagement and some nonprofit, they also say the same thing, is that, and also people from the community, is that they lost their ability to listen after they become trained in these methods. They lost their ability to intuitively kind of interact, and instead we're looking at these kind of set methods as the right way to do things. So I think we only have time for maybe one answer, though this is a great question.
Yeah, sometimes the problem that we have when it comes to research, it's where people put at loggerheads qualitative method and quantitative methods, and think that this one is the best one, that one is. I think, as a researcher, we have to think more holistically, because for me, research is about solving a problem. And so you have to ask yourself, what will be the best way to solve the problem? And that's why I always say to my students, you can't decide upfront whether you are going to use qualitative or quantitative methods. The problem must tell us what will be best. Will it be qualitative or will it be quantitative? And obviously, the institutions where we attend may be focusing particularly on qualitative or on quantitative. But as you develop yourself as a researcher, you have to have an overall understanding of research methods, research approaches, so that you can actually be able to apply the correct tool to the correct problem.
I know there was only one, but just 30 seconds, because this is I think a super important question. And well, I'm in a research department within a policy environment, so I'm naturally self-selected into policy work. But I think what is rewarding about doing policy work as a researcher is that you end up changing the question you ask for your from your research. There is blue sky research that will always be there, will advance sort of knowledge for each discipline and across disciplines, but the fact that you engage in methods that might be relevant for policy helps you sort of think deeply about the research question you're asking for your academic career. And so I think sort of there's a change in the way you think what is what I'm studying really important, and what kind of problems it might be solving for my discipline, but also for in general for the world. And so I think that's the exciting part of sort of doing policy research. It's something that you try to engage in questions that might be important for somebody.
Thank you so much. And with that, can we give our panelists a big hand?